Weird Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 5. Corpse at the Console. The Laufen Valley in Switzerland is a dark, narrow valley framed by limestone cliffs, and through it flows the river Birs, which empties into the Rhine at Bâle. There are castles, some ruined, some inhabited, on either side, and you see them as you travel on the local train along the Laufen Valley through the villages to Bâle. When you see the gloomy castle of Angenstein, with its tall stone keep ahead of you, you know the next stop is the village of Aesch. The castle is built on a rocky outcrop and towers over the valley. The train disappears into a tunnel beneath it, and on the other side it pulls up in Aesch station.
Next halt, Aesch.
I emerged from the train and began to climb the steps to the castle gate as night was falling. A thunderstorm was brewing in the Jura mountains, as they often do in the late hours, and I could see the distant play of lightning and hear the roll of thunder. Owls were hooting from the castle battlements and the surrounding hillsides, their mournful calls echoing through the valley. I had come to Aesch this chilly October night to hear an advertised lecture. It was to be given by Dr Batliner on his collection of skeletons and skulls in a private museum housed in the castle. The title of the lecture, to be delivered to a local seniors group, was Famous Dead Men in Aesch. Now, Dr Batliner is a renowned physical anthropologist with a European reputation, and his lecture did not disappoint. Indeed, there was a point to the title of the lecture, as we found out, for he referred to corpses he had studied that were brought here from elsewhere and spent a few weeks in his laboratory before being returned to their various graves, crypts and mausoleums. He first recalled his early work, going through the bones and skulls from a mass pauper's grave in Vienna in quest of the skull of Mozart, though the results were inconclusive. He then talked about his work on a mummified monk from the old Franciscan church in Bâle, and Shepenese, the Egyptian mummy from the monastery library in St. Gallen, which he had to restore. He also recounted a piece of forensic investigation long after the fact. He was brought the corpse of a 16th century knight who won fame in foreign wars but died at home in St. Gallen under suspicious circumstances in 1596. This was Johann Philipp von Hohensax, known as the Black Knight. He died of his injuries following an altercation in a hostelry involving relatives of his who were disputing an inheritance with him. On examining him in 1996, exactly 400 years after his death, Dr Batliner found that the Black Knight had been murdered. Strangled, in fact. Someone wanted to make sure he didn't recover from a blow on the head he had received in the tavern brawl. The corpse was very well preserved, naturally mummified in fact, due to the dry air of the crypt in which it had been kept. That year, 1996, turned out to be a real annus horribilis for the laboratory, but in a positive sense, professionally. That year was the centenary of the death of Anton Bruckner, the great romantic composer, and Dr Batliner recounted that he had exhumed the mummified corpse of Bruckner in Austria and had brought it here to Aesch to be examined and cleaned up, following which it was returned to its grave. This was perhaps the most illustrious of the famous dead men referred to in the title of the lecture, if one discounted the questionable Mozart skull. After the lecture was over, many of us repaired down to the Schlosskeller, an old hostelry beside the castle, where we sat before the dancing flames of an autumn fire, and those who were interested asked the doctor further questions about his museum and his specimens. After the others had gone, I found myself the last guest still there, so I took the opportunity to ask Dr Batliner about Bruckner. I had a feeling there was more to this affair than he had let on. "Herr Doctor," I said, "you surprised us by saying that Bruckner had visited Aesch, though it was 100 years after his death. You restored the great man's body. I would like to hear the whole story of this. It seems to me you might have been holding back some of the more grisly details." Dr Batliner chuckled, emptied the dottle from his pipe on the grate of the fire, and refreshed it with fresh tobacco. He said,
"I knew someone would want to hear the story, but it was too grisly for the members of the public at large. What is more, if I told it in public, no one would believe me or take me seriously as a scientific investigator."
Meanwhile, I discreetly beckoned the Fräulein over and ordered another half bottle of the fine local red wine from the valley, Arlesheimer Schloss Biersek. Dr Batliner held his newly filled glass up to the firelight, and it shone ruby red to his appreciation. With another puff on his pipe, he began to tell his strange story.
Anton Bruckner died in the year 1896 in Vienna. Under the terms of his will, he was buried in a sarcophagus in the crypt of St. Florian's monastery near Linz, underneath the great organ there which he had played at the outset of his career. For his first real musical job was as titular organist at St. Florian's. So it was only natural, perhaps, that he should want to have his final resting place where he had started out in the world of music. He wrote in his will that he wanted to be placed in a metal coffin and then in a freestanding sarcophagus down in the crypt. It was as if he thought he would still be able to hear the mighty organ above. In order to ensure that he would be presentable for this honour, he stipulated that his body was to be embalmed by Dr. Paltauf, a Viennese doctor, with the new formaldehyde method he had pioneered. Bruckner said he wanted to be treated as a first-class corpse, and all his wishes were fulfilled, as this happens.
Here Dr Batliner could not refrain from laughing, taking the pipe out of his mouth to give full vent to his amusement.
You know, Bruckner was always fascinated with death and corpses. He went to executions. He was keen to see the skull of the unfortunate Emperor Maximilian, who was shot in Mexico by a firing squad in 1867, when the body was at last returned to the Habsburgs in Vienna. He saw famous composers exhumed, such as Schubert and Beethoven, when their graves were transferred to other cemeteries. It was said that, as a composer, he just wanted to kiss their skulls. Somewhat grisly, though, yeah? Yet that was not so unusual. You know that Goethe wrote a poem describing his encounter with the skull of his friend Schiller. He said in the poem that it did not make him shudder with cold, but warmed him with enthusiasm when he thought of the genius of Schiller, his brain that had been contained in that empty skull. And in those days, people did have the opportunity to caress skulls, or at least to look at them. When graveyards were reused for other purposes, the bones were gathered up and put in an ossuary. There always used to be a motto inscribed over the grinning skulls as they looked out at you from behind an iron grill. You are what we were. We are what you will be. There was a tradition of this fascination with skulls, and nowhere more than in Vienna. One thinks of Dr. Franz Gall, the inventor of phrenology, who collected skulls for his personal museum. He was eager to acquire skulls of people he knew as soon as they died, so that he could relate their personality and abilities to the bumps on their crania. So much did this prospect appall people who knew Gall, that the Kaiser's librarian in Vienna at the time actually stipulated in his will that Gall was not to get his skull. Other scientists also had their grisly collections too, just like I do. So Bruckner was perhaps not so eccentric after all in his interest in skeletons, mummified bodies, and skulls. Admittedly, he was not a medical man, no more than Goethe was in his time. Bruckner was, as I suppose, morbidly fascinated with death. He wanted to know what remains, what is left of the dead man. The instructions he left in his will for his own embalming and burial are strange, I must admit. It was as if he hoped to live on in his crypt, listening to the organ above being played by his successors, maybe even coming back sometime. He reminds me of those people today who want to have their bodies or brains frozen in the hope that one day science will be able to unfreeze them and restore them to life. Anyway, Bruckner had achieved a certain fame in the last years of his life in Vienna, so that he was able to get the kind of resting place after death that he wanted. Yet he remained the prime example of a composer who for most of his life was ignored or discounted. Hitler, in his time, became a great admirer of Bruckner. It is not hard to see why. Bruckner came from the area around Linz, where Hitler grew up. Here was an Austrian provincial boy who was not taken seriously at first, but eventually imposed the fact of his genius on the world. Just like Hitler, who wanted to be taken seriously as an artist and failed, though later he became a dictator and was taken seriously then. After meeting Wagner, another great favourite of Hitler, Bruckner gave up being a church organist and embraced symphonic music instead. But he was not taken seriously in Vienna by the critics. Hitler and people like him said that these were Jewish critics. It was all a Jewish conspiracy to keep an honest Austrian boy down. So the Nazis viewed him. In 1937, when Hitler was already at the peak of his power, he unveiled a bust of Bruckner in Valhalla, the German Pantheon near Regensburg. During the war, Hitler got his propaganda minister, Dr. Goebbels, to expel the monks from St. Florian's monastery, with a view to turning it into a Bruckner museum. Hitler himself paid for the collection of books and music for this museum in St. Florian's. He also wanted to have the bell tower in Linz play a Bruckner theme for its chime. But the end of the war put an end to all these plans. Still, when Hitler committed suicide on the last day in April 1945, the announcement of his death on German radio the next day was followed by the playing of Bruckner's famous Adagio from the Seventh Symphony. Well, after the war, the monks returned to St. Florian. The church remained a church, and Bruckner was left in peace down in the crypt below the organ loft. It was intended in Austria to mark the centenary of his death in 1996 with a number of events. They decided to renovate the crypt and the sarcophagus, and so were thinking of exhuming Bruckner and taking a look at him to see if the embalming had worked and if he was still there, mummified as he might well be. I was offered a commission by the Austrians to examine his remains and restore them appropriately. They remembered my work on Mozart's skull. I was in two minds whether to accept, as it would mean a lot of work. The body would have to come all the way over here to my laboratory, which would be an awkward and risky business. But then I got a curious telephone call. It was from Augustinus Ettinger, who introduced himself as the titular organist at St. Florian's. He explained that he had just been appointed that same year, and he was very concerned about the state of Bruckner's body down in the crypt below. "What?" I exclaimed. "Do you think he has started to decompose?" "No, it's not that," he said, "but there have been strange goings-on here in the church." "What kind of goings-on?" I asked. There was a silence. Then I heard Ettinger's voice say, "I cannot really talk about it, at least not on the telephone. You would not believe me anyway. I need to show you and tell you what is happening. I am calling you now just to ask you, to implore you, to come to St. Florian's, so that you can exhume the body and take it away with you, and do something with it." I was so impressed with the sincerity of the young organist's plea that I soon agreed to go to St. Florian's and help him with this mysterious problem. So I wrote to the authorities in Austria post-haste, informing them that I would accept their commission and not to begin the exhumation till I arrived. A week later, having confided my other corpses to my laboratory assistants, I took the train from Bâle to Zurich, and then the all-night express from Zurich to Vienna, getting off in the early morning in Linz. A suburban train brought me out to St. Florian's. The monastery is beautiful and peaceful. The church there is a Baroque jewel, like so many in Austria, and the organ is something wondrous to behold. It is called to this day the Bruckner organ, for it was the organ he played when he was titular organist there, and it has 103 registers and well over 7,000 pipes. It has a magnificent sound, and I thought that, for Bruckner, it must have been only a step from playing and composing for this symphonic organ to the symphony orchestra itself. All was quiet, however, as I entered the church. I had arranged to meet Ettinger privately here, so he could tell me his secret, whatever it was. After walking up the nave, I perceived a young man in a dark suit coming towards me. This must be he. Ettinger introduced himself and welcomed me with a few words of fervent thanks for my coming. Then he turned to the organ, and with a wave of his hand upwards he said, "There it is, in all its glory." After a pause, he pointed to what seemed to be a vaulted crypt directly below the organ loft. "And there is he." I had no need to ask who was meant. I followed in silence as Ettinger walked ahead of me into the cavernous crypt he had indicated. Inside, there were funerary inscriptions around the walls, but there was a freestanding catafalque with a heavily ornamented sarcophagus resting on it. We approached, he with a look of dread, myself just curious at this stage. "Here is the burial place of Anton Bruckner," he said in an awed whisper. "He has been here, unmoved, for a century now." I looked at the sarcophagus, then all around me. "So, did you smell something?" I asked matter-of-factly. "It smells just like a normal crypt to me." "Ah, but Herr Doctor," he replied in the same awed whisper, "he is no longer at rest. He is haunting the church and the organ." I stared at him. "I knew you would not believe me. You probably think me mad," he said. "Perhaps I am mad, or I am going mad." He covered his face in his hands. "Come," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "Tell me all that has happened, the strange events you spoke of, that have convinced you Bruckner is alive, or undead." Ettinger shuddered, and then, without saying anything yet, he drew me away from the sarcophagus and out of the crypt. We went and sat in a pew in the nave. "When I came here at first," he said, "there was nothing I liked better than to lock myself in the church during the evening and experience the organ and all it could do, all I could make it do. Of course I was aware of the fact that Bruckner's grave was down in the crypt, and that I would always somehow have an audience of one. He would be listening. It grew on me, that sense of not being alone. It did not bother me. It was a consolation, in fact. I felt part of a tradition greater than myself. But then, oh God, during the pauses between my playing, I started to hear footsteps down in the crypt and in the nave. I told myself there could be no one there. Even the sacristan was gone for the evening, and I had locked myself in the church. I played on. But then, when I paused, I heard footsteps again, this time on the stairs, those wooden stairs that spiral up from the ground level to the organ loft. I heard them coming, getting louder, as if someone was approaching. Then the footsteps died away. I got up from the console and looked down, but I could see no one. This experience went on for a week or two. But one evening, as I played, the footsteps on the stairs were to be heard again, louder and louder as they came closer. I dared not go and look. I sat at the console, and suddenly I felt myself enveloped by icy air. I sat there, shivering, unable to turn around as the footsteps reached the top. There was a pause for a minute or two. Then I felt an icy hand on my shoulder. I could stand it no longer. I jumped up from the console with a loud scream of terror and fled from the organ loft, running down the wooden stairs till I got to the nave. Then I paused in the near darkness to catch my breath. I looked back up. Far away up there was a light in the organ loft, and I thought I saw the shadow of a man as he set the stops and registers and then began to play. He was playing Bach. "That must have been very disturbing," I said. "What else has happened?" "Well," he said, "since that night I have not dared to play the organ here after dark. But in the evenings when I am going home, if I am the last one to lock up, I might stop for a moment in the nave, and then I hear those footsteps going up the stairs to the organ loft. I seem to see a shadowy figure moving upwards there. And then? I usually turn and flee out of the church then. I cannot stand it. But once I waited, alone in the gathering darkness, and after a while I heard him begin to play." That was enough to make me go out of the church, I can tell you. But people who live around the monastery have told me they have heard the organ being played at night, when there are no lights in the church and the doors are all locked. They wanted to know if I was practicing in here late at night. Of course I was not. "I see," I said. "So what do you want me to do?" "I want you to exhume him and take him away. There is something obviously wrong. I have heard nothing of this from other musicians who have been titular organists here. I cannot help thinking that the embalming of Bruckner's body has somehow worn off, and that it has made him restless." "That is possible," I replied. "There is one thing that I have learned in all my years of work, and it is that one must deal very carefully with skulls and mummies and corpses. They are sensitive to what is happening to them. I do not know why, but it is not by chance. The tradition tells us to exercise great reverence in dealing with the remains of the dead. Anyway, when we open the grave tomorrow, we shall see what state he is in, and what I can do." The next day, a small party sworn to secrecy went down into the crypt. I was there, so was Ettinger, as well as the abbot of the monastery and some local officials. We broke open the sarcophagus with a hammer and chisel and removed the lid. Inside, as expected, was a metal coffin. On examining it, I could see that it was damaged. There was a hole in one side of it. That meant air had been getting in, which was not good for the embalmed corpse. Anyway, we unscrewed the lid of the coffin and opened it. Now we saw Bruckner in person, as it were, and everyone gasped or groaned, because he was much the worse for wear. It seemed to my practised eye that the formaldehyde used in the embalming had dried out, and although the body was perfectly preserved, it had been attacked by fungus and mould in several places. This was confirmed when I studied the body at my leisure back here in Aesch. I decided on the spot to take the body back with me right away. The abbot and the Austrian officials were very much concerned that secrecy be maintained, as they wanted no sensational stories in the press about Bruckner going out of the country for cosmetic treatment. Ettinger, the organist, just looked relieved. So the upshot of it was this. We wrapped Bruckner in 2 layers of plastic, and I hired a large car to drive him across the border into Switzerland. It would have to be a Nacht- und Nebel-Aktion, a cloak and dagger operation. I would have to smuggle him across the border. We put him in the boot of the car and closed it. Then I drove him through Austria and Liechtenstein and across the border into Switzerland. Luckily the customs men did not want to open the boot, because if they had, they would have found Bruckner, still recognizable after 100 years, staring up at them. When I got back to Aesch that night, I needed a stiff drink. I got to work on him in the laboratory the next day. There was no time to lose. I was able to see the fungus and mould on the body, and to see exactly what it was. Consulting some pathologist colleagues in Basel, I decided to take it off with X-rays. That was successful. Then I worked on the body to re-embalm it and stop the decomposition. I told no one what I was doing and who the corpse was. It was just the two of us there, Bruckner and Batliner.
The old investigator chuckled and puffed on his pipe. I was prompted to ask him, "Did you see any sign of him getting up and walking about?" Dr. Batliner laughed at this.
No, but in the course of the week he was there were some strange events reported to me. A ghostly figure was seen by the locals at night walking near the castle here. And strange to say, people in nearby Arlesheim noticed activity in the old cathedral. You know that the church in Arlesheim was built as a cathedral for the Bishop of Basel in the 18th century, and it actually has an organ built by the master builder Silbermann, who built organs for Johann Sebastian Bach. Anyway, the locals said that around midnight, while all was dark and the cathedral was locked up, they saw strange lights inside and heard someone playing the Silbermann organ.
But no one knew the corpse of Bruckner was in your laboratory, I blurted. So they couldn't have imagined it all, could they? Dr. Batliner chuckled again.
No, and I was not going to tell them. I could not, could I? I was sworn to secrecy. Who knows what they saw?
Surely, Herr Doctor, as a man of science, you could not believe in such things, I exclaimed ironically. Dr. Batliner sighed. He took his pipe out of his mouth and looked at me seriously.
Yes, I am a man of science, but a man of science who spends his days with the dead. And as I said to young Ettinger, I have seen enough strange things in my time to know that the dead cannot be disturbed without there being consequences.
He went back to puffing on his pipe, and there was silence for a while between us. All that could be heard was the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of thunder in the Jura. After a while, Dr. Batliner looked up and said,
But I must come to the end of my tale. Eventually I got the body of Bruckner all cleaned up and re-embalmed, so he looked as if he had just died yesterday. His appearance was irreproachable. A first-class corpse. I smuggled it back into Austria in the car and drove it straight to St. Florian, where the officials were waiting to reinter it in the sarcophagus and seal it up for another 100 years. I can tell you the young organist, Ettinger, continued to look relieved. He was there once again when we put back old Bruckner in the sarcophagus, encased in a new metal coffin. I telephoned him a few times afterwards to inquire if all was well at St. Florian's, and he assured me that the corpse lay quietly in its grave in the crypt below, no matter how loudly he played the organ. So Ettinger at least was happy and could now enjoy his position as Bruckner's successor at the Council of St. Florian's. I think he stayed there for nearly 20 years. Since then he has moved to Vienna, I believe. Anyway, Bruckner has not disturbed anyone since then. At least I have not heard from the new titular organist. Last month in Austria They were celebrating the 200th anniversary of Bruckner's birth. But if old Bruckner should decompose again in the course of the next 100 years, who knows what terrors a future organist might experience yet? But I, for one, will not be around to deal with the problem. I will be with Bruckner in the grave.
You have been listening to Corpse at the Console by Turlough Conmee from Weird Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.